So you got to see a little bit of my life and my work.
I started that project with my friend Nancy. They showed her at the end of the film about 10 years ago. There's thousands of people that have gone through that park, and we've had 2 reoffenses out of probably about 1,500 people. So it's less than a 1% relapse rate. There's nothing magical about sex offenders, really. Most of them are untreated victims. I think you saw that. Most of them struggle with addiction issues. Most of them were molested by their own families, so they got a lot of secrets. And in America, one of the big criticisms is if you struggle with these issues, you can't go to a therapist like me. We have to turn you in. There's no real help. And of course, if you get turned in, if you admit anything, you go to prison for an average of 10 years. And it's like the old drug problems in America back in the 40s or 50s. If you were a heroin addict and you went to the police, you got an automatic 10-year sentence. We've come a long way. We still have a war on drugs that's not healthy, but the politicians realize criminalizing the addiction world is not the answer. Hopefully someday we'll come to accept that this is a problem. It's a mental health problem. It's a social problem. It can't be treated, but we have to give people opportunities to get help before they act out. In Europe, I live in Europe now, the countries over there are doing that. They're starting to do that. They have free groups for pedophiles. They don't have any mandatory reporting, and they're really trying to get people to come out of the shadows and out of the closet with their problems. I'm part of the psychiatric industry. This year we've taken the pedophile diagnosis out of the DSM-5. The law enforcement world is not going to go along with that, obviously, but we look at it as more of a sexual orientation. There are some people that are born with a fixation on children. We're not going to change them. All you can do is provide groups and support and services to them so they don't act on what to them appears to be a normal drive. We took homosexuality out of the diagnostic manual 15 years ago, but we're just starting to address the pedophilia. It sounds very complex, but it's not really that bad. I've had a lot of jobs in my life. I've worked in the addiction field. There's a sexual addiction component to this too, but a lot of it is learned behavior. I hope the film portrayed that. So if you have any other questions, I'll be glad to shoot.
Yeah, no, I was curious about the addiction issue, because I was just trying to get a sense of how you were talking about it. So it sounds like you're using it in a couple of different ways. Were there sometimes you were talking about it in relation to other elements in people's lives? Sometimes you were talking about the specific activities related to their crimes as being addictive sort of behaviors. Like, how are you thinking about the connections between sort of addiction and these behaviors?
I like to look at it as an addiction for a lot of reasons. Some of them are personal. I try to model a lot of what the 12-step world has to offer, and I try to preach to my clients that they need to find their own support systems. You know what they say, when 2 alcoholics are talking, they're having a meeting. I'm always promoting that kind of thinking. Surprisingly, even alcoholics, when they go into recovery, they go through a period, they say 50% of them hit this sexual addiction phase and they start acting out. If you stop a chemical, your brain will start craving some other kind of addictive release, for lack of a better word. There's a great movie on that called Thanks for Sharing. It's about sexual addiction. These are all people in recovery for drugs and alcohol, but they go through this sexual addiction piece. We call them process addictions. There are chemical addictions, but there are also process addictions. So my clients struggle with process addictions connected with their former chemical addictions. They are not allowed to smoke pot anymore, obviously, and they're drug tested. They're all on probation, an average of 10 years, 20 years probation. So they're more likely to cycle back into sexual addiction issues, make poor choices in relationships. So we kind of try to warn them, that it's a phase that they're going to go through. It's not purely like, shooting a drug, but there is a component to it. If you were molested by a family member and you kept the secret, and most families do not report. When I started in this business, I was working with incest cases. That's all I had. 90% of sexual abuse in America is family members. It's not people grabbing kids from behind bushes, although the media will lead you to think that. It's not the case. It's people that you know and people that you love. Like Tracy's father. So they're not reporting anymore. There's a lot of secrets. My clients are medicating a lot of family secrets. You saw Bill. He was the kind of the main protagonist. He's the one, the maintenance guy who did a lot of talking. He was beaten and battered, emotionally abused by his family. A lot of my clients were horribly emotionally abused or physically abused. Then they hooked up with somebody that molested them in their formative years, and they misperceived that experience as loving and caring. That's another scenario. If you were molested as a child, you may also come to accept there's nothing wrong with it. This happened to me and I'm okay. You know, it's an eerie parallel to see that they hook up with, or they start acting out against children that were the same age that they were molested. And they use the same grooming techniques that were used on them. So it's learned behavior that becomes very compulsive. And that's kind of what addiction is, you know, something that you lose control over. I don't know if that answers your question enough.
I'm interested in the film itself and how it came to be and what has been its history since it was made. First of all, it's interesting that it was made by Swedish people with support from Scandinavia. However, instead of making a film about the progressive kind of treatment that you mentioned in those countries, they chose to make it in the United States. And so I'm wondering how it came to be made in the place it did. And then I'm interested in how it's been used as a film, how it's been distributed or shown. And what's important about this kind of film is it's the kind of film ideally that ought to get on public television, you know, on independent lens or something. So can you talk about the origin of the film and its distribution and history since it was made?
Okay, I'll go back a couple steps, but excellent question. I'm a believer that these people, my clients, need to not hide and cower for the rest of their lives. So I've always been media savvy and connected and have pushed my clients, not forced them, but encouraged them to speak to the media, to do newspaper articles, to appear on national television. So my clients kind of they're kind of conditioned to being okay with that, which is very unusual with this population. My clients actually gave me the idea, and I saw how therapeutic it was for them to start telling their stories to strangers. It gave them a sense that they were helping other victims or other offenders from acting out. We even had a television show in Florida for 8 years. My clients starred on the show. They did all the interviews, and we did the camera work. You know, I don't believe anybody's ever done that before. CNN found out about it, and I like CNN. I've done things with them before, but they kind of sensationalized it, and then all the local media started stalking all the clients that I put on the show, and I had to kill the show. But it gives you an example of, I think it's therapeutic for them to do these things. I have a reputation, I guess, now for having those kind of clients that are willing to talk. The American press doesn't really want to deal with me, you know? And when they do, it's very sensationalistic. We've done Oprah. I was on Tyra Banks. She cut 19 minutes out of the 20 minutes because they don't want to hear what we have to say. So I'm not really happy with the American media anyway. I don't take Dr. Phil's calls or Dr. Drew, although I did see Dr. Drew's presentation with offenders, and I was impressed, and I thought maybe I might have missed an opportunity there. He was pretty even-handed, but most of these national shows are terrible, and I've kind of given up on them. I'm more responsive to the European people that come to us. We've had the Italians and some British have done news stories, and the French, and I think these Swedish producers read about us. They were curious, so they came. They spent a week in film. They went back to Sweden, and they were working for a company. Well, the company said, no, this is too controversial. We're not going to go any further with it. They quit their jobs, took all the money they had, came back to America. They couldn't use the footage from the year before because the company they worked for owned it, started over again, and did this thing on their own. There was no preparation in the sense that we don't rehearse anything. You saw I was wearing the same shirt, you know, in the sessions. They just would come in and film us. They decided who they were going to select as subjects. I didn't have any control over that, didn't want any control. I didn't force anybody to do anything. It's all just very natural, not scripted, okay? But my clients are acclimated towards doing this. They believe that I'm right, that they need to tell their stories and it's good for them. I think Europeans are more interested in what the Americans are doing to the sex offenders as a warning. They don't want this stuff to happen in Europe. There are politicians, I understand, over there banging the drum about harsh laws, and the Europeans are a little more sensitive, I think, about giving up civil liberties. You probably didn't hear all the horrors that they were subjected to. I don't think we want the film to look like it's a bunch of whiners and complainers. But these are people that really, their lives are almost over. They can't go anywhere, they can't do anything. They're on strict curfews, they can't ever date. You know, it's hard for them to ever get a job. For the rest of their lives, they have to register. I created that park with my friend Nancy because they can't live anywhere. They just make them live under bridges and out in the woods. That's not going to help protect society by pushing them off a cliff. So we created these services for them to keep them safe and to give them a place where they can, you know, start to heal and grow. But I'm kind of the only therapist that really looks at it as a social work thing. I am trained clinically, but for me it's more of you got to put your hands on there like 12-Step has done and really work with these people on a day-to-day basis. All of my staff are my clients. I empower them to become professionals. I train them how to deal with the probation officers in the courts and try to lift up their self-esteem. And I try to educate the system and teach the system that they have to take these people seriously. You know, they're human beings and they've got a skill, and we can tap that and they can do some good things with it. You just saw a snapshot of one or 2 days at the palace, but we've been doing that for 10 years. Once again, the Americans aren't interested in seeing it. I know that the producers tried to get HBO and a few networks to air it, but they're just not interested. Has shown in Australia, all across the country, and it has shown in all the Scandinavian countries. But the Americans are, we're not ready to help these people, have any compassion for them yet.
And it's had some festival shows.
It's had a lot of festival shows. Yes.
I have a question about how, in your experience as a counselor, the kind of gender balance with folks who are convicted of sex crimes, because it was really fascinating to get Tracy's perspective and her story. And typically, when we tend to think of sex offenders, we think of men. So I was just curious.
Our society is not ready to accept that women molest children, so unless you get turned in or caught red-handed, most of my female offenders were in that category. They turned themselves in or something horrific happened, but still it's very rare that you see them. But I've done my own research. I started the second program in Florida in 1983, so I was into my 33rd year, just going into my 33rd year working with these guys and a few women. And I've done my own little research. About half of the sex offenders have been molested by females. You saw Bill, the first guy, his babysitter molested him and his brother. She used her underwear, you know, to masturbate him for years. He really has a fetish now. He can't like ejaculate unless he has this underwear connection. It's funny how fetishes are formed, you know, experiences in your past can follow you, even though you intellectually understand that he still needs that sex aid, you know, to be sexual with adults. Has a lot of awareness. He has a lot of counseling. He was a crack addict. He had a lot of issues. He's come a long way. He was one of my staff members, helped me with all the groups, but he still needs that damn underwear, you know. Part of the interesting thing is if you were molested by a female and you were a guy, you're in denial about that. You're not protecting family members necessarily, but you're, hey, you know, I seduced her, that kind of thing. And that's the double standard in America. Apparently, they're only arresting teachers that molest their students now, female teachers. We had a famous one in Tampa. She was too pretty to go to prison, you know. And when they do catch them, they rarely get any harsh punishments. So that double standard is still out there. If you are convinced that your experience with an older woman when you were 10 or 12 years old was healthy, that's part of your denial. And until you can come to accept that. A lot of people say, oh, offenders just want to all say they're victims, they want sympathy. But I found as a therapist, it's really hard to get them to go and look at that. They want to minimize it or deny it or, you know, say it's no big deal because it's painful. And they've spent years and years covering that up or self-medicating that. So acknowledging the victim piece of where they learn this behavior, that's almost an advanced part of their counseling. But I would say there's probably as many female offenders in my experience as there are male offenders. We're just not ready to accept that yet.
It's a great, very moving film, so thank you. I was actually, you were talking about a double standard that kind of crosses gender lines, and I was also wondering if there might be a double standard that cuts across class lines. Actually, many of these offenders that we were watching were, you know, lower middle class.
Right.
And I would assume that just as 12-step programs tend to cut across class lines, so does sexual offenses. So I was wondering if you could speak to that dynamic at all. What do we know about sort of upper class sex offenses?
They usually have the best lawyers, so you know if you have money and power and connections, you can get a better deal in court. Justice is blind kind of thing. If you don't have a lot of resources and you wind up with the public defender, you're probably going to get 10 or 20 years for something that you might get 5 years for or 1 year, like Jamie. You know, Jamie had a master's degree. He came from a family with some resources. He got a 1-year sentence. So there's no fairness. Life isn't fair, right? But those things happen all the time. The sentences aren't always consistent. But what is consistent is...
Does that also mean limited treatment for sex offenders who are upper class? Or?
Sometimes. There are games you can play to get around treatment. Because treatment is considered scary and it's an expense. And a lot of offenders don't have the money. Part of how I dealt with that was I've always worked 2 or 3 jobs so I could support my program. My clients were usually very poor, and I don't get any tax, grants or anything like that. So I've been rewarded by their hard work and their success. And, that's enough for me. I'm a workaholic. I guess that's my addiction. You're probably wondering, am I a victim or do I have an addiction? Yeah, I probably do. I've always worked 2 or 3 jobs at one time. I was working for a psychiatric hospital for the last 8 years while that piece was being filmed. I worked for a bunch of doctors, which is helpful because I get a lot of the mentally ill people that are suffering from depression and anxiety. PTSD, surviving a toxic prison system in Florida almost creates PTSD. They touched on that a little bit in the beginning of the film. So it was good that I knew the medication game and could hook them up with the right things. But I think I lost your question by going too far around the barn. But
No, this was great. Thanks.
Now that you're retired, what's the future of this park?
This park used to be called Blood Alley. It was the worst park in Pinellas County, Florida. The motorcycle gangs operated it. It was a drug dealing park. There were shootings and stabbings there weekly. We cleaned it up, made it a nice place actually. Well, as nice as it can be for trailers from 1950. The owner, after we did this film, pretty much fired all my staff and moved us out of there. Now, he's benefiting from all the offenders, and now that he's known to the Department of Corrections, he's getting referrals. But all the social services that I used to provide, and of course I'm not there anymore either, have all died off. So I'm starting another project by remote control. I still have my staff that are all my graduate clients, and we're going in with the county of Pinellas and purchasing a hotel in another part of town that can house 150 offenders, and we're going to recreate the palace in another part of town. So I still have my hand in these projects.
How do you think that might be different?
Not sure, because there'll be different players and I won't be the therapist seeing them every day. I guess I could go back and forth a little bit, but I think the Department of Corrections is tired of me. They've had to put up with me for 30 years. It's time for somebody else to take over.
What was the biggest obstacle in your relationship with the Department of Corrections, looking back?
I would give a lot of credit to the probation officers. They're like social workers like me. But there were a lot of bad ones. A lot of people were afraid if the offenders messed up on their watch, they would be fired and lose their pensions. So, you know, I had my following with the right kind of probation officers, and probably half of them in the county really liked me and referred to me. And I got all the poor ones because I didn't kick anybody out if they didn't have the money. My fees were ridiculous anyway, so I was very popular, and I had done it a long, long time, so I was very well known. I would say that probation has to go along with the laws in Florida. It's not probation's fault that these laws are more and more caustic and more abusive. That comes from Tallahassee, that comes from the politicians. And the law enforcement machine is not very helpful. They're advocating for these very harsh laws. I wish they would not wage a war on drugs. I think we've come to accept that that's a failure. You can't give law enforcement all the control over social problems. And that's what they do in Florida. I think that was mentioned in the film too. We spend more money building prisons in Florida than we do on schools. The teacher salary, we're 48th out of 50 in the nation for spending on education in Florida. The teachers get dismal salaries. They're not invested in rehabilitation. They took all the counseling out of the prisons. You know, prison could be an opportunity. If I were governor, I would make prisons like a university. You would go there, you would get a degree, you would graduate, we would work on your issues, and it would be, you know, an investment in the taxpayers' dollars. Let's do something positive. You got a captive audience, but they squander those opportunities. They don't do anything. There's no counseling, nothing. They won't even give them sex offender treatment. And I've more than proven to the authorities that you can do it for free, you know. We've operated all our programs really out of our own pockets. And I'm not a rich man accordingly, but I do okay. You know, I have a house still in Florida. I have property in the mountains in North Carolina. I live in Italy. I'm doing okay, even working with the poor and getting no help from the government. So it could be done. You just have to want to do it. I was commenting to somebody that there's a sadness in my heart. I don't see any young therapists coming up and wanting to work with this population anymore. And I suspect it's because the media has demonized them so badly that they're afraid to. Of course, there's not a lot of money in it either, but we're kind of like the last few colleagues in the county, and they've been working with the offenders almost as long as me. We're all going to have to retire. We don't know who's going to take over for us. My fantasy is there would be a 12-step group in every neighborhood in America and around the world, like Germany and some of these countries are starting to do, where there's confidential, free services for people to go and share their thoughts and their fears and their experiences of acting out deviant behaviors. We're just not there yet. I also shared with somebody else that
it's been sad for me, when I started this work, we were willing to reunite families. I was willing to get the offenders and the victims and the mothers and the siblings. It was a year-long, 2-year-long, 3-year-long process. I worked for a family treatment center at the time and put these families back together with a lot of hard work. Now, they don't even want to hear about that. If you don't take out a restraining order against your husband within 24 hours, they take your children away from you in Florida. So there's no family healing, there's no belief that anything can improve. We need to get back to, where we were 30 years ago. We were demonstrating lots of success helping these families. And that's why families don't report anymore. I hardly have any family cases anymore. And 90% of sexual abuse is family. So Florida's become addicted to the offenders too. They like them, they generate money and income. Now they're manufacturing. That was one of my complaints in the film. They've got all these stings. They're famous in Florida for stinging these young college kids that go on adult websites looking for sex. And they get all hooked up and everything, and then they'll say, oh, can my 15-year-old daughter come along? Or would you be willing to kiss my daughter or teach her something about sex? And wham, you're a sex offender for life. That's entrapment. Entrapment's legal in Florida. I don't think those people are really sex offenders. I had a whole group of those kids in my program. So I think the Europeans are trying to warn their citizens by showing what's going on in America. Let's not make those mistakes here. And that's why the Europeans come to me.
One other question. The film didn't show any interaction between the outside community and the residents of the park. It showed some social events and things within the park. And the other question is how what seemed to be a very decent housing residential condition was supported financially. It wasn't clear to me where this could, because most of these people were not holding regular jobs, or were they?
They were day labor, that kind of thing.
Were they paying into the support of the
Yes,
park?
we were charging them.
And then what about the interaction with the external community and with their families? Did family members come to visit, and how much interaction did they have?
Family members came sometime. They came from all over the state of Florida. They weren't just residents of our county because we were the only place a lot of the offenders could go. You can't live 1,000 feet from a school, a park, a playground, a bus stop, a daycare center, a church, so pretty much they forced them out into the woods. South Florida, which is Miami, Broward County, they went to 2,500 feet. That's a half mile. Well, you can't spit without, crossing something that's on the list. So they came from all over the state to our park. And they weren't necessarily residents of our county. And that was an issue with the county. Now Don's importing them into our county. They didn't like that. But because they never caused any problems and there weren't any real reoffenses, the issues died down. It's called Pervert Park because that's what the neighbors call us. They joke about, we don't call it Pervert Park. It's called the Palace Mobile Home Park. That's the official name of the park, but all the locals called it Pervert Park. They pretty much stayed out of it. Now, I did have a lot of problems with prostitutes. The prostitutes in our county are the crack dealers, and they would sneak into the park in the middle of the night. Like I said, half of my offenders are addicts. They've been in prison 10, 20 years. They're pretty lonely. They're pretty, randy, and they would fall prey to that. But it's hard to keep them out. I don't have, police officers helping me or anything. If you want to get into a real relationship and fall in love, your girlfriend's welcome. If your family's in town, you can come to my group. If your victim's old enough and it's not in your court order that you can't have contact with her, your victim can even come to my group. I draw a lot of fire from my colleagues for doing that, but I come from a family treatment center. I believe in bringing in anybody and everybody that wants to come, okay? So my groups, the film didn't show the real picture there. We were careful. We didn't want to, get
too much trouble, but sometimes I'll have 40 or 50 people in a group, which is way beyond what clinically is acceptable. You're only supposed to have 10 or 15, but I'm inviting in just about anybody at any time. And I let my clients come to as many groups as they want. They're not locked in. I wanted them to know everybody in the park. And I would bring in guests. And I would also bring in speakers, and I would bring in my old clients. I've been doing it so long. I have clients that go back 30 years. I would bring them in to speak. So it was a constant flux of, very untraditional therapy compared to what my colleagues do. They'll take 8 or 10 people, and those 8 or 10 people will work in a group for 2 years, and nobody else will go in or out of that group. Mine looked like a circus by comparison. But I'm encouraging them to socialize and bring in their friends and bring in their family members, and that's really healing, you know. And I wanted therapy to be fun. I know I'm not making jokes today, but I really have a good sense of humor, and we had a lot of fun with the counseling. We really did. As I said before, most people think I had the worst. How could you work with those? Oh my God, they weren't hard to work with. They really appreciated that somebody cared about them and looked out for them, and I really enjoyed it. And I've had a lot of jobs. I've worked in many different counseling venues. They were always my favorite people to be with.